Bonjour, Kinamagi and Nene Ireland Indigenicas, and welcome to this episode of Social Studies Explorer. Today's episode, Chapter 3, Section 2, the Southern Colonies. We'll begin this section with a just view of Google Earth. And I do want a tool here. When we look at the Southern Colonies, we're looking basically this region right in here. At this time, and I'm going to put an E for England, down here was controlled by Spain. Up here, France. And obviously the Spanish Empire includes a lot more than Florida. That's pretty much everything down here was Spanish. This region along the St. Lawrence was the French, and the English are kind of boxed in these regions. But the Southern colonies are what we look at the modern day states of Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia. A lot of textbooks start up here in New England, so this is a little bit of difference from your normal text. And we do consider like New York, New Jersey, Delaware to be the middle colonies, and we'll discuss them another day. So I'm going to go ahead and clear these drawings so that they don't follow us through our lesson here. And let's begin at the home page for Section 2, the Southern Colonies. Just a reminder, you may see a Chapter 3 PDF that does include the links to the resources versus the printed copy. The printed copy is still available in your Google Classroom post if you just want to read this section. But if you want to use the active links, you will in fact need to look at the whole chapter 1. So the Southern Colony section begins on page 53, and the guided inquiry questions: why did different colonial regions develop, and how did regions impact life in the emerging nation? Vocabulary includes charter, joint venture company, indentured servants, and proprietary colony. We do notice that there is cotton in the image at the top. That might foreshadow a little bit about this lesson, so let's look into that as we go. It is a little bit longer section. It goes to page 59 in this chapter, so there's a little bit more reading, and I'm going to read it for you. The English wanted to capitalize on all the newfound wealth that was coming out of the new lands. Queen Elizabeth I gave Sir Walter Raleigh a charter. This document granted him the right to establish a colony in North America to find gold and other resources. The colony, Virginia, was named in honor of the Queen. So charter, that first vocabulary word, is basically a permission slip to take this land and make it English. No word yet on if the Queen had a permission slip from the Native Americans to give away their land. Highly doubt it. Funding for the travel and development would be left to Raleigh. He gathered up 100 men who had little to no experience in surviving off any land or region, and they set sail. Doesn't seem like a good idea. Just saying. Raleigh decided to establish this first English settlement on Roanoke Island in what is now the state of North Carolina. You can see some maps here. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is one that you've probably heard of. There have been more than a few TV shows on your different educational televisions about this. So what would it take to survive in the wilderness? An area on Roanoke Island was decided on for settling. Unfortunately, it was too late in the season to plant crops. The local native people assisted the settlers and helped in providing food. In spite of their generosity, Ralph Lane, who was the leader, had little respect for the tribe. His conflicts with them led to his death. Following this, the tribe then refused to assist the settlers, leaving them with only the supplies they had brought from England. Thus, when Sir Francis Drake, another explorer, arrived in the area in 1586, the settlers begged him to take them home. The first English attempt at settling the New World was a failure. Who else here is not surprised that fighting with the people that you need help of is probably not a good strategy for survival, especially when many of the people that are coming with on these expeditions have no idea how to do anything resulting or resembling work. So, in the summer of 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh made a second attempt at settling at Roanoke. He financed a voyage of 150 persons. They arrived in late July. John White was in charge as governor. He had been accompanied on the voyage by his daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband. Shortly after their arrival, Eleanor gave birth to the first English child born on New World soil. Her parents named her Virginia. Yes, that question will apparently pop up from time to time in trivia games or in social studies classes as being the first English child born here. And that is about the end of her discussion. So the colonists went to work fixing up the abandoned settlement, repairing the houses they found, and preparing a home. This group was different from the first, as it included women and children. So life in the colony began to take shape. Near the end of summer, it was decided that more supplies would be needed before winter. John White set sail for England and the much needed supplies. When White arrived back in England, he found the country at war with Spain. This prevented his return to Roanoke with the supplies. It took nearly 3 years before he managed to make it back. What he found was curious and would, to this day, leave historians asking the question, what became of the settlers of Roanoke? Very few clues to their fate were discovered. 2 carvings in trees were found, one red crow and the other Croatoan. The Croatoan were a local American Indian group. Had the settlers been attacked? Was the decision made to join this tribe? These questions remain unanswered today. Another clue was the discovery of some family treasures White had left buried at the settlement. The maps and drawings were destroyed, and the books were missing their covers. White returned to England. Neither he nor Raleigh had the funding to make a third attempt. The Roanoke settlement was abandoned. And yes, to this day, we're still trying to figure out what exactly happened. There are people called archaeologists. Those are people who study leftover artifacts to try to figure out what happened next in this story. Maybe you will be inspired and answer that question yourself. Jamestown and the Virginia Company. Private funding for development into the New World led to the establishment of joint venture companies. There's a vocab word there. In a joint venture, the risk is shared among multiple investors. One group created the Virginia Company, a for-profit business, and a charter was granted in 1606 by the English King James. 3 directions were given to the company. First, they were to establish a trading post. Second, search for gold. And finally, look for a water route to Asia. So joint ventures is no different than companies today where you buy stock in. It would be the equivalent of everyone in our class throwing $5 in to start a company. We might all lose our $5, but it's a little bit easier to bear losing $5 than if we lost the entire $80 by one person. Again, you see that word charter or permission slip here, as I'm going to call it, even though the term is charter. But it's kind of like a permission slip to take someone's land in this case. By December of 1606, 3 ships were loaded with supplies and 100 men set sail for the colony. Upon arriving, they had to make a decision as where to place the colony. Many factors went into the decision of where to build. The first year was difficult because the settlers arrived during the winter. Jamestown was the name given to the settlement. This location was swampy, the water was poor, and insects caused problems. Of the 100 settlers, 29 were listed as gentlemen. These were wealthy men who were used to comfortable lifestyles. In Jamestown, they were carving out a life in the wilderness, altogether different from the one they'd been raised to live. Polite term, they didn't do a whole lot of work, and they didn't think they had to. Over 30 tribes of American Indians, most belonging to the Powhatan Confederacy, lived in the area. They were united under a leader who was given the name Powhatan by the settlers. Conflicts began almost instantly. The colonists themselves created trouble when they began stealing crops from the local natives. Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, assisted the settlers. With her help, the colony struggled to survive. I will point out there's a large amount of debate about relationship of Pocahontas to the colonists. In fact, a little bit is mentioned here in the biography of John Smith, which is linked in this text. And you can kind of read about it here, especially when it comes to the certain events like her saving Smith's life. And you can kind of scroll through here and check it out on your own. You can see that part here. However, there are historians who question whether this event actually happened. His relationship between Smith and Pocahontas has largely been romanticized by popular culture. It is also theorized that Smith might have been taking part in a ritualized acceptance ceremony as opposed to an actual execution. Powhatan possibly saw Smith as a resource in trade relations with the Europeans and the acquisition of arms, and hence wanted him alive. So I always like to make sure that I point out the possibility that things could go a little bit differently than we are told. There is now also a link here to Historic Jamestown. And you can see the website's landing page here, historicjamestown.org, and town spelled with an E. It's a British spelling. And there's some pretty cool stuff on here. You can read about different people. The first General Assembly, because you'll learn later that the first representative government in the what's now the United States was formed in this area by the House of Burgesses in the early 1600s. And obviously Jamestown's landing is around 1607, so about a dozen years later. You'll hear about the first Africans, aka the first slaves of the new English colonies, the chief, and then Pocahontas, and then the John, Smith, and Rolfe. So cool stuff there. Collections. You can see some of the artifacts. You can see these people doing archaeology. You can make a plan to visit. Maybe one of these days I will have to make a trip out here and do our own little recordings from there. Don't think it'll happen due to COVID when I go out to Virginia in a few weeks, but it would have been pretty cool to take our whole class, let's be honest here. All right, moving on to page 56. You see the link here. And there's also an article to the value of tobacco. From an English perspective, tobacco becomes a very popular product to smoke. However, they're not using it in a sacred way. It's pretty much just to smoke it. That's contrary to our beliefs about the medicinal value and religious and spiritual value of using the sema. All right, so at the top of the page, at first, Jamestown lacked effective leadership. Not enough of the work was being done by the gentlemen, and thus not enough food could be grown. Sidebar, the gentlemen were lazy and thought someone else should do it. It appeared as if the colony would fail. But in 1608, John Smith became president of the council. His leadership appeared to turn things around. His new policy was, you don't work, you don't eat. Under his guidance, the colony went back to the job of establishing a working settlement. And a question here: how do you think such a law as you don't work, you don't eat could benefit a new developing colony? Keep in mind, the English people had no idea yet how to survive in the wilderness of eastern North America. And obviously, at points, they weren't very good at building relations with people who actually knew how to do it, that had been living here for untold numbers of centuries. So we're going to have to figure it out. And maybe by saying, well, would you like to eat? Then you better do some work. 150 new settlers were with supplies. I bounced a little far. Smith was injured severely when his gunpowder bag ignited in 1609. He returned to England. While he was gone, the gentlemen returned to their old ways. This time was known as the starving time. Imagine that. When people don't do anything to help grow crops, people starve. That winter, without Smith leading the colony, over half of the settlers died. The 60 survivors decided to abandon the settlement in the spring. They traveled down the James River and were met at the mouth of the river by a group of 150 new settlers with supplies. They agreed to return and help reestablish the colony. John Rolfe began experimenting with tobacco growing. It is believed that he was assisted by Pocahontas, whom he later married. Tobacco became the gold that Jamestown needed to show a profit. This cash crop was very successful, and by 1613, Rolfe was growing a plant called tobacco that was well liked by the people of England and throughout Europe. Men were coming to Jamestown, but after making some money, they left and returned to England. It was an adventure to them. Jamestown wanted and needed more permanent residents. In 1619, three major events occurred in Jamestown. Women, slaves, and self-rule appeared in the colony. The Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative body in the colonies. Yes, you will need to know that on many tests in social studies education. House of Burgesses, 1619, first legislative body. This group was created in an effort to encourage craftsmen from England to move to and settle in the colonies. With the promise of a stable government, people might be more interested in moving to the colonies. Craftsmen and their wives and families arrived and made the colonies their permanent home. Finally, as agriculture started to develop, a cheap labor force was needed and slavery was established in the southern colonies. Obviously, a sentence at the bottom of one paragraph about the House of Burgesses does not do justice. We know that the stain of slavery impacts our nation to this day. And it starts here in Jamestown in 1619. Same year we get representative government, we get slavery. So there's a great juxtaposition between those two events. So that's a lot about Virginia. And there's more that you can learn if you want to take the time to look at the links or research. And let's look at Maryland and the Calverts. A wealthy Catholic family called the Calverts lived in England. They felt that the Church of England was persecuting them for their religious practices. George Calvert, the head of the family, obtained a charter in 1632 to establish a for-profit proprietary colony in the New World. Proprietary means that is for profit, often in these cases owned by somebody. In this case, it would be Lord Baltimore, along with the king, because the king still owns everything. Lord Baltimore, as Calvert was known, was given instructions to name the colony in honor of King Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, so it was called Maryland. The colony would also allow them to freely and safely practice their faith. With prior knowledge of the difficulties that Roanoke and the Virginia Company had faced, the family planned well for their colony. By 1633, under the leadership of one of Calvert's sons, the expedition began. Many of the settlers on the voyage came as indentured servants. There's another vocab word. These people were given transportation and housing in exchange for their labor once they arrived. They were contractually bound for a set number of years, usually 7, to live and work in the colony to pay off their debt. Indentured servants are different than slaves in that there was the expectation that they would be freed when their time was up. And freed often included some basic supplies, maybe a house, a plot of land from which they could build their own lives. Slaves did not have those same expectations as their situation was permanent, although some were able to purchase their freedom by doing extra work. Um, but they weren't going to be given the resources to survive easily. Now, what would make someone willing to give up everything they knew to travel to an unknown place to work for 5 to 7 years? The answer to that: Europe is not the greatest place in the world to live if you are not rich. Cities are dirty, crowded, not a lot of opportunity. And unless you're an aristocrat, your life isn't going to get significantly better. So they hope that, hey, let's move to the new world and have start over. Some people will later come because they're in debt, and this is the only way that they can pay off said debt. And obviously, with the Calverts, we see that this was their hope to practice their own religion. Advertisements were placed looking for people who had the skills needed and desired for a new life in the colonies. And you can see this little ad here: wanted to go to Maryland, a blacksmith, a young man, unmarried, bred to country business such as plow, cons, axes, hoes, and can shoe a horse and any other thing that may offer, and will bind for 4 or 5 years. He will find good encouragement. For further particulars, inquire at William Brown, June Merchant in Glasgow. So this one would have been coming from what's now Scotland. And if you notice where it looked like some letter F's that I was pronouncing as an S, there was different letter formation in those days. That's one of the things that I've been able to pick up as someone who's read a fair amount of history, and may not be obvious to a 5th grade student who's just starting on their learning journey. But we can talk more about that at another time. So that's Maryland, Lord Baltimore, and Baltimore being the city everyone knows in Maryland, the home of athletic teams and giant aquariums. Pretty cool place. Also some mountains. So now let's move to North and South Carolina split. After Roanoke, the lost colony was situated in an island that today is part of North Carolina. It was not part of the establishment of the Carolina colony. King Charles of England had provided a land grant in 1663 for the establishment of a colony between Virginia and Spanish Florida. This was to be a proprietary colony. 8 wealthy gentlemen were assigned to run the colony as a business, and they were looking to make a profit in this new land. As the proprietors or owners, they created a constitution for the settlement that gave some self-governing power to the colonists, but most of the power was retained by the King Charles. In the southern area of Carolina, a town called Charlestown was established in 1680. Where do you think they came up with that name? Newsflash, they named it after the king, because flattery does work. A deep water harbor at this location allowed ships to move easily, so Charlestown became a major trade center for this region and would remain that way for centuries. Many of the earliest settlers to this region had come from the Caribbean island of Barbados. They had experience in growing cash crops on large farms called plantations. You'll want to remember that term, plantation, is a large farm. They also brought slaves from Africa with them to work these new super farms. Indigo, a plant used to make blue dye, and rice were perfectly suited to the geography of this area. So if we ask for some cash crops, we've had tobacco. I mentioned briefly cotton earlier. Now we have rice and indigo. These 2 cash crops led to a larger number of enslaved Africans being brought into the colony. Slavery contributed to the economic success of these kinds of farms. In the northern part of the Carolina region, many indentured servants from the Virginia colony moved and settled there. The terms of their service had offered them land in exchange for years of service. They developed many small tobacco farms. Later, lumber became a major economic activity. Smaller farms and harvesting trees for lumber did not call for a larger labor force. Thus, slavery did not expand in the northern part of Carolina. Also, without a deep water harbor in the north, they did not have the ability to ship large amounts of goods back to Europe. The population swelled as people continued to move into the Carolinas, making it difficult to monitor and govern. The differences in economic activities between the North and South also added to these difficulties. By 1712, the settlement divided into two separate colonies, South Carolina and North Carolina. Now let's go down to Georgia. Protection from Spanish and French invasion into the English colonies was one of the main factors that led to the development of the most southern of the 13 original colonies. It was noted earlier in the chapter that Spain had established its presence in Florida, and the French had been in the present-day Carolinas and Georgia. As England extended its colonization southward, it became necessary to protect its colonies and growing assets in the New World. To facilitate this defensive measure, a military man was recruited. James Oglethorpe received a charter to establish the colony of Virginia from King George II in 1732. Oglethorpe was not only a military leader, he was also a social reformer. This meant that he wanted to help change how people were treated and lived in society. He had an idea that this new colony at the southern edge of England's claimed lands should be populated with debtors. Debtors were people who owed money and found themselves jailed because of their inability to pay the money back. By moving to the new colony, debtors could be released from debtors' prison and they could begin again fresh in Georgia. Oglethorpe believed that these debtors would work hard at a second chance in life and slavery would not be necessary. Although no debtors ever ended up going to Georgia, careful consideration was given to the selection of colonists. With over 100 years in North America, England had learned a lot about building successful colonies. Potential colonists were interviewed, and 116 men, women, and children with a variety of skills and abilities were selected for travel to Georgia. The Creek was an American Indian group in the area. To succeed in the region, Oglethorpe knew that he had to interact positively with them. Tomochichi was the leader of the Yamakra group, who were part of the Creek tribe. The two became friends. Oglethorpe eventually invited Tomochichi to England so that he could meet King George II. Tomochichi told the Creek that they should remember the kindness of the king, and he hoped that a friendly relationship would continue to exist between the colonists and the native people. Originally, Oglethorpe had a plan to raise silkworms. Unfortunately, the industry did not succeed, so an alternative economic activity was sought. It was found that tobacco also grew well in the area, and colonists began growing it. Eventually, rice was also planted in the colony. Slavery had originally been banned in Georgia, and as the need for workers increased, some settlers began to smuggle slaves into the area. This ban was lifted in 1750, and some of the South Carolina growers brought slaves with them as they began expanding into Georgia. By the 1760s, slaves were being brought directly to this English colony from Africa. So you can see there's a lot of information to digest in that very long section. And we should take the time to look at the links. There's a lot that can be discussed, especially if you watch the video ahead of time. You can ask questions of me during our live stream. This will conclude this lesson. You should return to the Google Classroom to check for your understanding using the Google form. And we'll be back next week with new episodes of Social Studies Explorer. Mama P.